I wanted to do a brief introduction of Dave. Some of you already know Dave pretty well, but for others, this may be your first time. Spencer and I interviewed Dave in February, and we subsequently met him in person during the Theory Underground tour when they stopped in KC earlier. And now they are here, and Anne is here, which is great. Great to see you again. Dave is the founder of Theory Underground, which is a teaching, research, and publishing platform. Reading Dave's description of Theory Underground, which is the best one, it is, quote, by and for dropout workers with earbuds and burnout postgrads who want to understand the situation as a means towards finding out the conditions of possibility for the good life. I love that. I love that description. Dave's books are Waypoint, Time Energy, Critical Media Theory, and Culture War, and Time Energy, Why You Have No Time or Energy. And I've got that one. It's a good one. Theory Underground has also recently published an anthology called Underground Theory, which features works by famous authors in the theory scene, along with cutting edge works by fellow travelers and students of Theory Underground. And I'll put all that in the chat. So I'll turn it over to Dave to speak to us on nature, nurture, and natality. So welcome, Dave.
Thank you, Lori. And thank you everybody for being here. It's a really awesome turnout and good to see you all. And just to double check two things about the time limit, and also, what did you say that this is live streams? Like, is this currently going out on YouTube or something?
No, it's just live for the folks that are here. Yeah, we don't live stream otherwise, but we put your talk out on YouTube later. And as far as the time limits, try to aim at about an hour, I would say.
Oh, hey, yeah, I can work with that. I can work with that.
Okay.
Because I thought it was going to be something like a half hour, and I can work with that too. But
45 minutes to an hour, but we have like an hour and a half total. To like with questions and stuff. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. All right. Well, that's a little bit more breathing room. And so I'm very, happy about that. I like to do long form content. And so one of the big things about serving workers with earbuds is that, it's not just any and all workers with earbuds. A lot of workers with earbuds listen to podcasts that have nothing to do with the kinds of stuff that I'm into, and other ones they listen to music. And so the kind of workers with earbuds I've tended to speak to are kind of like myself in their age range and interests. And so I don't claim to speak to everybody or for anyone really, but the this demographic of workers with earbuds, I do like to think of it as a radical new potential in the world. The fact that there are people with large amounts of disposable time listening to things while at work. Without that emergence, it would not be true that the golden standard of the time constraints or length of a podcast is industry standard wise 3 hours. Right. And it is because of the Joe Rogan experience. And so Joe Rogan has normalized that. It's just a 3-hour conversation. And that leaves a lot of room to kind of do the human thing, feel a person out, touch on something, maybe come back to it if it feels right. And, so a podcast host like Joe Rogan is pretty good at doing that kind of thing. And it's something I've tried to model in our own approach. But at the end of the day, whenever I do interviews with somebody who's doing cutting edge work in the world of theory, the time constraints are usually a little bit more set by academia, right? Because people doing cutting edge work are still usually working at the university. And so that's why the conversations that I've had with, for instance, Dr. Lori Johnson here, have been within those time constraints. But time constraints are actually kind of a nice jumping off point into pretty much all of my work. And so I kind of wanted to play off of that idea. It's sort of meta maybe, but time is for me one of the two biggest problems but also concepts that we can think about, especially in relation to the crises that we're facing today, in late stage capitalism or modernity or whatever you like to call it. People have their different ways of talking about our current situation. But just to kick this thing off here, I'm going to move. You should be able to hear me just fine as I move over here with my wireless microphone. But do let me know if there's any problems with seeing or hearing me here. Okay. I can see you all, so that's good. I'm going to put up on the whiteboard a sort of roadmap for today. And I'll touch on every one of these things quickly, but not too quickly. And then if you're feeling a little left behind by anything, probably good to assume that other people feel that way as well, and that there's no such thing as a stupid question in this space. And so I'll be super excited to hear what your thoughts or provocations or questions are at the end. But I'm going to just start by putting the logic symbol for negation up here, and then the modal logic symbol for necessity, and then inside of that one, the symbol for possibility, for the conditions, the necessary conditions of possibility being negated. For what? And then this is the symbol for time energy. And so we kind of start this off by talking about how the conditions of possibility for time energy have been negated. Is it coming through okay, or is it mirrored? Is it backwards from your side?
It's coming.
It's good? Okay.
Yeah.
Sometimes Zoom makes it so everything's backwards, but okay, good. And I'll start off by saying that time energy, the symbol here, time energy, it comes from basically just putting together a lowercase e and a t. So that's a t, that's an e, and you could just put the line through the e. And it developed as a shorthand because I was interested in developing a shorthand back when I was writing about this stuff a lot. And I was saying time and energy a lot. And I was thinking about it from the position, in part, of the critique of political economy. So you can think of the work of, say, Karl Marx, but then also the existential phenomenological critique of how our being in the world gets shattered in modernity. And so that would be more like Heidegger.
Just let it go. I was just hyping you out, but
Sorry. Yeah, thank you for getting that, Lori. So I want to make it a little less abstract before I go into the definition of time energy. The word is meant to be intuitive. I think it's meant to make hipsters who really like fancy French sounding jargon feel like it's a little too plebeian, or like it's like almost like a peasant neologism. It's meant to be a little antagonistic to a more fine arts sensibility. It's supposed to be a bit more populist in that sense, because it's supposed to be immediately intuitive. Time energy, right? You instantly hear the words time and energy, and you can sense that they're being mashed together. And if I use that term in conversation with any regular person, the chances are they think I just kind of said it too quickly and I mashed the two words together. But people don't tend to blink or even wince, because that's a normal thing that people say. People say time and energy, and people say it so often that I've actually noticed since I wrote the book, Time Energy, sometimes people say time energy and it's like they just dropped the word "and" by accident. So it's like there's almost something there that's going on that I think I'm getting at with this term. But I'm gonna take it from the intuitive level and then go a little bit deeper and make it a little bit more rigorous with a more analytic definition in a moment. But first, I think I'm just going to get a little personal. I think a lot of people can find something that's educational a little bit more relatable if there's a story component or something that kind of makes it human. And so I'll just say that for me, a really formative experience when I think about growing up out here in North Idaho was my mom always being stressed out and doing too many things, not being able to complete most of the things that she started. And when it came to our home education, they moved out here into North Idaho from California after moving there from Canada. They moved out here for freedom, to take a more deliberate role in our education. But though that was a big part of the reason they were here, it wasn't really cashing out. She wasn't really getting to spend that time with us. And it's because even though she believed, kind of from a sort of conservative traditionalist standpoint, that, you know, she should be raising the children and dad should be out there winning the bread, so to speak, she was still doing a lot of work for money from home. Some people might know of this phenomenon called multi-level marketing, where you're basically trying to sell a product or a line of products just to regular people in your life, in your church, whatever. And so it's like my mom always kind of had an elevator pitch on this product that she was selling, and she was always on the phone trying to do it. And then, you know, she's also like trying to garden and keep the house clean and make meals and having more and more children because they also believed in just letting God decide the number of children, which is also a thing that is a little popular around certain traditional conservative areas in the United States, or at least in some of the ideological niches. And I personally really admire my parents and how much they went from being just normal, kind of smoking cigarettes, drinking beers every evening, towny folks. You know, my mom had grown up on a farm, but she was living in town. She and my dad had met in high school, and they just started a normal family. But at some point, they kind of realized nobody was going anywhere. No one was taking an active, sort of deliberate role in kind of making their own lives. And my parents wanted to make a big change, and that's why they came to the United States. And for me, it was, I think it was even admirable then. Like when we were living in California, talking about moving up to North Idaho, I was really excited because, you know, I'd kind of already had ideas about Swiss Family Robinson and Robinson Crusoe and this sort of Little House in the Prairie sort of vision that my mom found so appealing. But the reality of it was that my mom was too stretched thin to be able to do the home education stuff that she wanted to do. And my dad would leave before the sun came up, and then he would not get home until after the sun went down. Now, I think that's a pretty normal experience around the world. I think at least 5 billion human beings are living some kind of a lifestyle that's a lot more like that. But there's obviously a lot of people in the developed Western world for whom it's not maybe as obvious because maybe you work a little bit more of a standard 9 to 5, right? But for me, it became very obvious very early on that they were always really exhausted. And that hurts. And I think it hurts families because when everybody's stressed out, things can feel very dysfunctional. And indeed, when you start to think that way, I think it kind of spirals from there. And so, you know, at the point that I ran away from home, I blamed my parents for everything. You know, I blame them for having a lot of kids. I blame them for not living in town. I blame them for all of these different things. It was a long time of living out in the world and kind of fending for myself and working a lot of dead-end jobs before, first of all, I began to relate to their economic struggles. Like that just came with trial and error and actually learning how difficult it is to actually do anything that we want to do. But it took going to college and discovering the work of Karl Marx, specifically his early work, Estranged Labor, for me to realize that all of that effort my parents were constantly pouring into things to get money was leaving them with no product of their labor. They were very DIY kinds of people, and they were ultimately, making the property, developing it, making it a nicer place to live and everything with us. And I think we learned some good frontier homesteading kinds of skills. But it wasn't until way later that I realized, no, we weren't just poor when it came to money. We were time energy broke. And so time energy comes from thinking about estranged labor and labor power in the work of the mature later Karl Marx with Das Kapital, volumes 1 through 3, where labor power is a commodity. Not just the labor that you sell to the capitalist and then you get paid wages, right? It's that your potential to labor is a commodity. Whether it is actually bought or not, whether it is actually well compensated or not, you have become, as Heidegger would say, a standing reserve of human resources to the global order. And the schooling system itself, though I didn't go through it, I was homeschooled, but I have a lot of friends. I've always had a lot of friends. And at this point, I can say everyone I know who's gone through the public schooling system has learned certain things, whether they did very well or not. They learned certain things going through that system. They learned where they belong in the system. They learned what they deserve in the system, right? And so we'll talk a little bit more about the professional managerialization of schooling and how that sort of leads to a bureaucratized corporatist form of capital in the 20th century. But the real point that I'm getting at here is that I just see that everyone has been turned into some kind of either professional or low-skill worker. And that's 1/3 of your life. It starts as a student and then it moves on into your worker or professional life. And outside of that, we're consumers. And so we're worker consumers. And of course, we're supposed to find our freedom in the consumption that we do. Well, time energy comes from basically thinking about Marx and Heidegger this way, from my own sort of struggles and seeing the people in my life struggle to have meaningful families and rich, thriving lives. People are often thinking the biggest problem is that they don't have money. And that is a big problem. But it is ultimately money so that they can do things, right? Money so that you can pay for something that someone else did with their time energy that was converted to labor power, right? And so the technical definition of time energy is large, energy-infused, repeatable blocks of time available. I often say socially available because I'm trying to drive home the idea that even if you were like laid off and you had unemployment checks, that would not be time energy if you have the habitus of a worker and you live within a social order where all of the recognition, esteem, respect that you can get from other people is tied to the work that you do. And also, even if you kind of didn't really care about all that, you still couldn't do things with other people because everyone else is constantly working or recovering from work. Because most of our consumer activities are a way of recovering from work. Like these white collar sort of PMC jobs, like they have people doing stuff like riding bicycles on the weekend, right? Oh, stay healthy, jog, stay healthy, go do yoga, and then ride your bicycle, right? Go do the Ironman. Yeah, that's a very like white collar thing because the whole week long, you barely did anything with your physical body. For the blue collar worker though, you've been working your body all week long. You are totally exhausted. The most you can do is veg out, maybe drink a little. I mean, maybe Frisbee, maybe you could throw the ball with your kid. It's more likely you'd go see a movie or do something that involves kind of walking or sitting because the fact is like physical exertion is what you've already been doing all week. And so the very hobbies that or pastimes that we try to find freedom in and meaning in, these become a sort of recovery from work, right? And there's a great piece by Theodore Adorno called Free Time. You can look it up. It's very enjoyable. And it's really just about this conundrum. And he's very well aware that as an academic who has active leisure, that most people, what they think of as free time is not really free time because they're exhausted and ultimately they're doing some kind of conspicuous consumption and it serves the clock, or at least it's in reference to the clock, right? You're taking an obligatory vacation because you know that's what you're supposed to be doing. But the activities that we're doing aren't really meaningful in the way that he talks about how he enjoys music. He doesn't just enjoy music. Music is not for Adorno a hobby. He says it's something that he is actively engaged in, right? When he listens to music, he's actively listening to that music. And then he goes and he plays on the piano, right? Like for Adorno, even though he's not a musician in the sense that that is his main path, he's not being a hobbyist. He lives music. And so when he listens to classical music, he is listening to Beethoven or Bach or Mozart the way that he is reading Hegel and Marx, right? So when I think of time energy, I think of the condition of possibility for being able to do that kind of active leisure project that Theodore Adorno is talking about when he's critiquing free time. But active leisure has a couple of more ancient roots, right? There are two terms. One is Latin and the other one is Greek. The Latin is otium and the Greek is skole. They both mean the same thing, active leisure. And Nietzsche is well aware that a working class revolution that leaves people with no active leisure is not a revolution worth having, because it's going to leave everybody, even if you have bread on the table and you did not used to have bread on the table, it will leave you barren at the level of spirit, of soul, of well, time energy. You won't have any really to speak of, right? And so when he saw these socialist uprisings, he saw people who were willing to destroy great works of art and wanted to bring everyone down to a common level. And so he was reacting to that, you know. And so when Daniel Tutt writes Nietzsche, no, this is not Daniel Tutt. Daniel Tutt's inspired by this guy. But when Lizardo writes Nietzsche, the aristocratic rebel, and from a leftist standpoint says this guy was fine with slavery because he believed so much in this active leisure time, there's this part of me that goes, yeah, but you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. The fact is he's saying that the left has lost the plot and that active leisure is the point, right? When we're thinking about the fruit of our labor, are we just thinking about consumable items and services, commodities? Or are we also thinking about labor-saving devices freeing us up from actually having to work as much? And when I talk this way, I run the risk of sounding like I'm an anti-work person. And there are definitely people who take up the concept of time energy in a sort of anti-work register. All I'm saying is that we have to think seriously about harnessing technology within reason for the sake of freeing up time and energy, not just to produce commodities, right? Whereas the anti-work person is like literally against work. But I think that there are noble forms of work that people feel called to do, and that if you were to replace those people with robots, though some other people who weren't getting served very well might now get served a little bit better, it's still gonna suck. So if, for instance, you need people to care for you, having a real human being with a nurturing heart caring for you makes a really big difference, right? As opposed to a person who just kind of comes in and checks your temperature and then leaves and doesn't really have like a human moment with you, doesn't really know anything about you or really care. right? And of course, nowadays, nurses are the most overworked, especially in med school, right? I talked to a med school student. She said, I think we're all being turned into Nazis, right? And what she meant was like we're being turned into bureaucratic instruments, almost punitive, like soldiers who just come in and get the thing done. And because we're so overworked, we're not able to actually have a more quality kind of time with people, right? Now, that's not always the case, and there are exceptional med school programs. Like I think Duquesne University tries to be different. And that's part of the reason why they make their nurses read Levinas. You know, like they're trying to get you to realize there's something beyond the totalization and instrumentalization and reduction of this system, right? But for the most part, this is a problem, right? Well, one of the things that Nietzsche says about otium, he says the aristocracy always had two fundamental principles or concerns, and that was otium and bellum. Right? Otium is active leisure, bellum is war. Active leisure and war. And of course, the reason that war even matters, sure, you can get some glory and maybe a title from whoever's in power, but beyond that, the real fruit of war can mean active leisure time, right? And that's what it meant for Romans in the Roman Empire: glory and leisure. And that's why snobs of old, prior to the bourgeoisie, prior to the rise of the bourgeoisie during the bourgeois revolutions, the old aristocracy was extremely condescending towards labor, right? I mean, in ancient Athens, if you had done stuff like work or selling things in the market, I think you had to wait 15 years before you were able to enter the Lyceum and engage in politics. You had to like cleanse yourself of all that and get into a different kind of headspace, right? Well, I'm not saying I want to go back to that kind of world, but I do really want to drive home this point about time energy, because while we could think about it at the level of our families becoming alienated to each other, right? Because we might have money and we might not have money, but ultimately we don't have the time and the energy. When we have time, we don't have energy. We are exhausted, right? And when we do have energy, it's not with repeatable, reliable, socially available kinds of time, right? So you have energy today, but it's not going to be reliable, right? Because this is just like a freak occurrence, having some energy outside of work. Okay, so the structural stultification of the conditions of possibility for time energy, it was the first symbol that I put up here on the board. The other symbols I'm going to put up here are A cubed, an acronym, the PCFM, T cubed, and N3 or N cubed. And the title of this talk is Nature, Nurture, and Natality. And so I'm going to kind of speed run A3 and PCFM and T3 and spend a lot more time on particularly nurture and natality before closing out. The A3 is, I think, one of the things that intellectuals who want to change the world will run into, which is to say there are three crises, three particular crises. I'm guessing many of you have felt one, two, or all three of these. And that is the crisis of academia, the crisis of activism, and the crisis of the attention economy. The crisis with academia, just to be brief, is to say that the idea of the university is not obviously attainable for most people who go and get a degree. Even if you do really great work, it's not obvious that you're going to be able to study the things you want to study to be able to teach the things that you want to be able to teach, and that you'll be able to do so with a reasonable number of students and a reasonable degree of freedom of speech. There is the crisis of activism feeding into the crisis of academia with the culture of censorship that often comes from both the left and the right today. But there is also the neoliberalization of the university, is how sociology people like to talk about it today, which is just to say, because everything's underfunded and it's being run like a business, you find yourself teaching way too many courses and way too many students in those courses, and then teaching the same stuff too often, which means that you're repeating yourself way too much. You know, it's like the band that makes it big, and so now you're not starving anymore. But the problem is you're playing the same songs over and over and over again. And think about like a musician who is a starving artist. They have a lot more time in a sort of sense, and also motivation to really grind on new things, learning new things, listening to different kinds of music in different ways, and also playing things in different ways, and like really mastering their instruments. But once you've made it big, now you're playing the same thing over and over and over again. It might be a great song, but how many times can you play it? Right? Well, it's the same thing for teachers, right? And so I think a lot of people going into academia right now, because we want to live this pursuit of truth, and a university seems to be like the one place where that would be allowed. We find that there are political and economic factors getting in the way of that pursuit. And so the whole horizon of possibilities is being collapsed, right? The horizon of possibilities for academia is being collapsed. And if you've been involved with activism much, you might have realized a lot of this is going nowhere. A lot of people are tailoring everything they do into a sort of set of slogans to make happy an extremely niche fringe of the movement that checks all the boxes for a whole bunch of mood and mode and belief dispositions and dogmas that just don't resonate with most people. And so the more you try to tailor yourself and your discourse to that audience, the more you're guaranteed to lose the ability to talk to most other people, which obviously if you're studying theory at the same time, that's just going to be a compounded problem, because you can't study theory much without further alienating yourself just from regular ways of speaking, right? Same would be true with analytic philosophy. You know, it's not just theory. Analytic philosophy also makes it very difficult to have a normal conversation with people who are speaking fast and loose, and you're supposed to kind of get the gist of where they're coming from, and a lot of black boxes where you're just supposed to know what it means but not dig too deep, or being exchanged because it's just average everyday discourse, right? And of course, average everyday discourse is only further problematized by the structural stultification of time energy, because that leads to functional illiteracy. When nobody has time to do leisure activities, books are one of the first things that go, not to mention music. And then finally, the attention economy. Well, maybe you thought, oh yeah, well, I really want to pursue this life of truth, or maybe I want to change the world through academia or activism respectively. But now here you are, realizing those things aren't going to work. And so you turn to the attention economy. This is an emerging field, so to speak. There's a whole kind of wild west out here. There's possibilities of meeting all kinds of people in all kinds of niches, and building new kinds of audiences, new kinds of communities, potentially a new kind of a school. And that's fantastic, except that all of the gravity of the attention economy in our lives today makes a lot of people, first of all, feel resentful towards all of that. And then they kind of don't want to be on the internet. They don't want to be around internet things. They don't like cameras all of a sudden. Whereas a lot of other people, maybe 50% of millennials, according to a lot of different articles, will say, that they want to become a YouTuber, right? So like 50% of people wanting to be a YouTuber, the next generation wanting to be a TikToker, wanting to be an influencer on Instagram. And ultimately, what is the driving force of all of that? It's to turn everything into content, right? And so these three crises all not only take for granted the structural stultification of time energy, and the reduction of our lives to a standing reserve of the commodity labor power. But they reify our modes of being that foreclose the possibility of the kinds of activities that would prioritize time energy freed up so that we can have active leisure in a state of skole. Skole, which is the root of school and of scholarly activities across the board. Anything that is scholarly has active leisure as its literal root, right? So that's the three crises. And I think that to say it's the three crises, obviously there's a lot of crises, and the structural stultification of time energy I take to be the fundamental crisis that needs to be focused on more. The reason it's like the three, besides the fact that it's alliteration with those three A's, and that's very nice because it's memorable. The more important point here is that these are immediate problems. They're obvious problems. One, two, or all three of these problems are problems that most people sense in some sort of way. And so it's a nice jumping off point with people. Some people, they've got a problem with little kids being on tablets or smartphones. Other people have a problem with like, well, should my kid really go to college? And then other people are like, oh my God, I'm so fed up with activism. But if you're like me, you ran into all three of these crises and you lived through them, right? And so for me, Theory Underground comes out of these three crises in particular. The structural stultification of time energy, well, that's a given. And I cannot see these three crises without thinking about that one. But then if you really tried to change things and you really wanted to go beyond folk politics, which is what Nick Cernicek and Alex Williams in their book about the future, is it called Inventing the Future? I think so. They talk about folk politics as being one of the problems with the left. And of course, they are left accelerationists. They are interested in, as am I, large-scale structural change. They're thinking about longer-term, serious, future-oriented kinds of social change. And they're kind of like, hey, guys, this folk politics thing, it's not really working. So what do they mean by folk politics? They're talking about when people really want to change the world, and so then they get together in a group of 5 to 25 people, and then they sit around and they talk about things, and they talk and they talk and they talk and they talk and they talk, and then they all come out with super, super sophisticated opinions about how everybody else should act and about what is or is not righteous, reasonable, or stupid. But ultimately, nothing that they're doing there trickles out into the broader culture in any way that has a serious possibility of large-scale structural change. And I would then add, and I don't think they really go there, but most of the ways that social change does trickle out from those spaces is a way that drives on popular resentment against those people who usually either have liberal arts degrees or spent too much time following influencers who either do or were aping people who do, right? And so this is where you get the sort of, you know, the excesses of identity politics, of gender activism, of disability activism, all very important things that get easily hijacked by folk political virtue hoarding, which is a term that Catherine Liu uses for what the PMC is ultimately doing in her book, Virtue Hoarders. And so that brings us here to the PMC, because if we're thinking about the problems with activism, I want to start with the second one, the PMC. Nod your head if you are already pretty familiar with that term. I can't read the chat if anybody's talking to me, by the way. I can see it goes off, but it's too far away for me to see. But virtue hoarding for Catherine Liu is when you have relative privilege, and you know you do, right? And you probably feel bad about it, and you probably try to do something about that politically, or at least you talk about it. You try to be self-aware about it, as most progressives are. But you end up with that relative privilege, spending a lot of time cultivating super sophisticated opinions about what the right way of child rearing is, or what the right way of dressing might be, or what the right way of eating is, right? And none of this is politics for her, right? And I admire her ability to critique this. She's actually a great polemicist, right? But the crisis of the PMC goes much deeper, I've discovered, through reading people like John Taylor Gatto, whose work, Weapons of Mass Instruction, made me aware that progressive education, the kind that is universal and coerced and age segregated en masse, that approach to education, though it had noble goals of bringing literacy to everybody, also had explicitly anti-working class goals as well, right? And so we're talking about President Woodrow Wilson, the first progressive, the one who invaded Soviet Russia in 1918 with the Allies, right? One of the things that we don't usually learn about. The Woodrow Wilson was in bed with the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, who back then was, you know, those guys were like Elon Musk and Bezos today, except that nowadays there's over 1,000 billionaires existing. Back then there were not so many, right? They were big sharks in a very small pool compared to Bezos and Musk, right? And so Carnegie and Rockefeller, like these guys and their education institutes, were very pro-education as well, but they wanted a specific kind of education that was a bit more scientific. And that's where Frederick Winslow Taylor comes in with his principles of scientific management, in which he is explicit as well about how this approach to management must make harmony between the good workers and the bosses, right? You got to get rid of the bad workers, the ones who want to organize, the ones who want to, you know, start unions and whatnot. We gotta cultivate an education system that is going to get out ahead of that kind of working class organizing. And Woodrow Wilson, I think in 1915, something like that. I have it in my book, but just off the top of my head, I can't remember the exact year, but it's right around then, right? You know, there's all this labor unrest. And he says when he was the president of the Ivy League university he was at the time, he said, we want two kinds of children. We want one kind that can lead and the other kind that can follow. And the kind that can lead is going to, by necessity, have to be very, very small. Right? This is where you're thinking about W.E.B. Du Bois's The Talented Tenth, another great work of progressive early 20th century America, right? The idea being we need a talented tenth, and he says of every race, but ultimately we need a talented tenth to be able to uplift and guide and control the lower 90%. And the education system should be such that it teaches that 90% who they are and what they deserve and kind of what lane to stay in. And so I'm not one of these people who's anti-scientific management, and I'm not anti-management, and I'm also not anti-professional, and I'm definitely not anti-PMC. And I hope that everybody here gets a cushy PMC job. Like that's not the point. The point is simply to understand the education system as PMC schooling. So it's not just schooling like, oh, you learned things. It's also disciplining the mass to teach us and sort of habituate us to a certain idea of meritocracy, right? Once again, one of those words that doesn't necessarily have to be bad. People getting things on the basis of merit is not necessarily always bad. The issue is with a system where, because you were sitting in the front of class and you were, for some strange reason, able to focus on all of these different subjects out of their context and out of any sort of practical application, and then you were able to get things done up against deadlines, all of the things that go into that, it cuts you out to be the top of your class, and now you think that that makes you a better kind of person and that you actually should be leading, right? The problem with that, the main problem with that, because it does have some grain of truth to it, but the main problem with it is that it replaced the advanced workers. Advanced workers were a thing. And so the proletariat, before it was hollowed out and then dispersed across the globe, the proletariat used to have advanced workers who had done everything in the factory and had built the social and cultural capital that they could then use to organize people when it came down to it if they needed to, right? But what Barbara Ehrenreich, in her piece with her husband called The Professional Managerial Class, what she says is that the capitalists realized that it's a lot more expensive to pay Pinkertons to come in and beat up striking workers than it is to just pay for better management. And it was people like Frederick Winslow Taylor and Edward Bernays who were kind of crafting entire new disciplines, entire new approaches to not just the management within workplaces, but also the managements of public consciousness. That's where Bernays comes in with propaganda, right? These are books that are written in an almost conspiratorial register where they're saying, hey, we can control people. Capital, we can control people and we can get out ahead of these strikes. We can bust the unions before they even form. And they were very openly loud about this kind of thing. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say that there is this part of me that's a little skeptical. Maybe they were kind of overselling the case just because they wanted the kind of job that they had. Like Edward Bernays, because of the clout and sort of sign value his name had achieved, he was able to be on $100,000 a year retainer with Columbia Rope Factory, right? Like that's a profound thing. In a world where everybody else is fighting for a job, he created a whole new job called public relations expert. And now all of a sudden he's a consultant for a rope company getting more money per year than the president of that company. And so part of the story of the PMC, the early progressive PMC, is not just a story of selling the idea of getting out ahead of labor organizing, preempting and undermining it to capitalists. It's also the idea of selling those capitalists on the idea that this is a real function that is needed. And to some extent, well, and to every extent, wherever it actually occurs, something that the working class was organically already doing was then displaced by somebody who had to go to college to get a degree to now do that thing. And one of the other areas Barbara Ehrenreich goes into to talk about this is like nurses and midwives, right? Nurses and midwives, these are traditionally roles that women are able to do. They might feel called to do. It didn't require going to college, and they were able to do it just fine in the working class. And now all of a sudden, working class women aren't allowed to practice these things, right? There's all kinds of penalties, legal restrictions, red tape, etc. So the PMC becomes a serious problem, and it's one of the three major factors of what I'm calling the PCFM, the post-class fractured mass, which is how I talk about in my work the situation we find ourselves in if we were tired of folk politics, we wanted to make large-scale structural change, so we turned to Marxism, and then we were trying to work within its world of concepts and categories. Well, one of the things that a lot of people came to the realization of was, oh, the situation has changed and there are new things on the ground. These are things that Marx and Engels didn't have to see or deal with. And Marxists, especially the most orthodox kind, don't tend to see or deal with those issues head on either. And so the PMC is a very big one. But then the other one would be the right here, the medium. The medium, we're kind of getting at it by talking about the attention economy, right? But the medium is a much deeper way of thinking about the attention economy because it's no longer about the content of the message, but about how the form of the medium itself fundamentally alters our experience of the world, of ourselves, and between ourselves, right? And the medium today, the smartphone being a metonym for that larger system that we can also kind of refer to as the internet, has found a way of taking video and audio and all of these other technologies from before and kind of consolidating them all into one place, right? And you know, this internet thing was built by anti-communists who wanted to collect information on people and get out ahead of labor organizing, right? So there's a great book on that called Surveillance Valley by Yasha Levine. It's not like a conspiracy theory book. It's just standard progressive fare. But it's about the history of DARPA, which later became the CIA, right? And so, you know, they build the internet. But of course, the way they fund the internet is by making the internet useful for capital. So it's like the state wants the internet to exist so that they can collect information the way that IBM was helping the National Socialists in 1930s Germany collect information on its people. IBM was helping with that, right? Well, the DARPA is thinking we want to do that, but we want to take it to another level because we're having this war out in Vietnam and we're realizing we've got to fight communism across the whole globe. So we have to take this to another level. And out of that kind of thinking and the application of cybernetic theory comes the internet. But the medium, when it was younger, as a concept, through the work of Marshall McLuhan, it was a bit more optimistic. You know, he has his pessimistic moments, but he believed that education would be all it takes to grow, to evolve with these technological revolutions, right? And so he's famous for saying the message is the medium. Or sorry, no, the medium is the message is what he says. The medium, it is the message. So most people, when they're doing a critical media analysis of something, they're looking at the content. But then what he wants to look at is how the form changes the message and the sensory experience, and ultimately how it interacts with our central nervous system in a very materialist way, right? And so that's what McLuhan's thinking about. But he's watching us become a post-literate humankind. You know, he calls it post-literate man. And he thinks that there's something bad there, maybe. You know, we're becoming less literate. We're not going to read books as much. But with the television, there's also the possibility of becoming part of a global village. If everybody has a TV in their living room, maybe we'll all actually kind of be a part of the same village. And he was, coming to fame during the 50s, and then he's being celebrated in the 60s. And then, of course, he's seeing the way that there is, activism being activated in the streets because people are seeing the Vietnam War through their television sets. And so that gives him reason to hope, right? And so he says, yeah, with some care and concern towards learning how to harness this medium and keeping in mind that it is actually changing the way we relate to the world and ourselves, there's serious hope for a global village to come about. Of course, I think we all realize that's not what happened. And so that's where Neil Postman comes in with Amusing Ourselves to Death. Now, I know you're all going to read that here at Maurin Academy, which is fantastic. David Ruiz is a big Postman head, and so he likes to promote Postman. I understand he's got you all excited to read Amusing Ourselves to Death. Well, Postman is a McLuhanite, and he's really, really good for thinking about McLuhan, but he's also like a more black-pilled, or we also say pessimistic, right? Black-pilled is just an internet slang for pessimistic. Postman is a bit more sober in his analysis, is how I might say that. And so that's Amusing Ourselves to Death is what we're doing instead of becoming a part of the global village. Or if it is a global village, it's a pretty dumb one. That'd be another way of saying it. It's not just dumb, it's deactivated. And that's where you have the situationists, Guy Debord or Guy Debord, right? The idea is that the spectacle sucks out our possibility for doing anything, and it actually deactivates us by making us passive. Jean Baudrillard will, a little bit later, also very influenced by McLuhan, he'll say it's not that we're becoming passive, actually, it's that we're becoming pseudo-activated. So it's pseudo-activism. We become pseudo-active. And I, of course, will then say that there's a dialectic between pseudo-activity and passivity, because whenever I see somebody doing something that is pseudo-active and I can see it as pseudo-activity, that actually incentivizes and justifies my passivity. So we could talk about the dialectic between the couch potato and the Antifa activist out there on the streets of Oregon or Portland, right? The last of the components of the PCFM then is gerrymandering Befindlichkeit. And I just did a lecture on that. I'm not going to go super into it. Basically, it's a huge thing. That's why I leave it untranslated. But basically, this has to do with the ways that capital and state, the political system and businesses through marketing and advertising, both have a vested interest in us being legible and predictable and expressing ourselves within ever refined, hyper niche little echo chambers that make us commodities, which make us, again, the word predictable is very important here. It makes us predictable. Are we all good? It says Zoom is not responding. I just got a little thing that popped up.
Coming through.
Oh, you're here.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
It maybe take like
Cool.
5 more minutes and then we probably should go to Q&A.
Yeah, perfect.
All right, great.
So yeah, the gerrymandering of Befindlichkeit is basically just you think about the way that you take a population and then you carve up the voting district in some weird way to make it a predictable, reliable demographic. That's what we all become through the internet. Well, what are we going to do about it? What do we need? We need large-scale structural change. The way we want to talk about that is T3 institutions. T3 stands for time, energy, talent, and teaching or tutelage, right? But those would be institutions that are not like most of our educational institutions today for the reasons that I already talked about. And so we need those, and we need those big and small. So local and universal kinds of projects that would focus on getting people their time, energy so that they can discover and then cultivate their talent under tutelage or teachers. Okay, so that's first. But finally, what this brings us all to is that capitalism and the exploitation of labor power and the exploitation of the Earth's resources doesn't just undermine our ability to have a meaningful life with like time in the day to have relationships and do the things that we care about. It's also undermining our ability to keep living on this planet, right? The erosion of soil that leads to dust bowls, the extraction of large-scale agriculture that leads to food that is only a simulacrum of food, not just hyper-processed, but also the produce aisle. These are simulacra of corn, simulacra of vegetables, right? These vegetables do not have the nutrient density. And it's in part because they're being picked so ahead of their season, right? Living within the cycles of the planet, and then also like learning how to care and tend for the earth is kind of like the next big phase of thinking about this stuff. And so we use N3 to talk about that. And so I'll just put those right here. And in the last like 3 minutes, I'll just say something about each of these three things. We have nature as the first one. We have nurture. And then we have natality. And I'll start with the last and just say that natality is being towards birth as opposed to being towards death. maybe during the Q&A, if the opportunity arises, I'll read a couple quotes about natality. I have some fantastic ones here from Jennifer Banks's book, Natality, Toward a Philosophy of Birth. But for now, I'll just say it's being towards birth as opposed to being towards death. It's a way of thinking intergenerationally as opposed to individually. Thinking forward generations. And then nurture, the idea of nurture is that we should be nurturing human beings, animals, plants, and soil. And then nature has to do with the contingencies and necessities that we find ourselves confronted with by the things that would be there regardless of whether we had a society or not, right? And so there's necessary contingencies and contingent necessities, and the coalescence of those things are something that we have to cope with and strategize about, to deal with, to harness, but to also safeguard against, because nature is violent, it's risky, it's dangerous, but it also brings natality, it brings the blossoming of new life and opportunities. But ultimately, nurture is what I want to think about, because normally we think about oppression, and then we think and domination, and this gets us thinking within a sort of binary where there's mutually exclusive sides between oppressors and oppressed groups. And I like what Wendell Berry says in The Unsettling of America, which is that this is a problem, this idea of mutually exclusive groups that have like these essential natures. He would prefer to think about it in terms of nurture versus exploitation. And then he says that this distinction between nurture and exploitation is one that exists not just between groups, but within every one of us. It runs through the heart of man in a sort of sense. And so I think that to have T3 institutions, or to reclaim our time energy, ultimately requires getting in touch with the realities of nature, and then learning how to nurture humans, animals, plants, and soil. And that's kind of what we're doing out here on the farm. And I started by talking about how I was growing up out here and I hated it and I ran away. And now here I am back. I'm like the prodigal son in a sort of sense. And it's because I realized it wasn't really my parents' fault that they didn't have time energy. That's a political economic problem. And I think ultimately, though I might have a lot of disagreements with them on various things, I think that they have a pretty good idea about what they're doing, and that they're ultimately out here building soil the same way that I want to, in the same way that Anne wants to. And so, yeah, that's what we're out here doing. So thanks for having me, everybody. This is great.